Hey there, thank you very much for joining me again. Today I am going to be talking about mixing and specifically the use of EQ. So let me provide a little bit of background on this. The goal of this video for anybody watching is, let's say you're a producer or you're somebody who's a composer, maybe making music for film scoring, media music, or really if you are doing this on your own just for your personal enjoyment. One of the limitations that we often face when we have produced a piece of music is getting past the samples, getting past our original material into the mixing stage where we can really bring it to life. And doing that can often seem extremely complicated. One of the overarching themes that comes through, I think, in all of my videos is an approach towards simplicity. I'm always looking for ways to get what I want from my musical productions in an approach that is very economical in the moment. Now, a lot of times I do have to kind of do really advanced technical things in my studio in order to facilitate that creative workflow where things are simple. But in this case, it doesn't really have to be that technical. And I think you can get a lot of bang for your buck out of what we're going to talk about, which is essentially just using EQ. So let me frame up a work example for you. I've got these two parts here. It's a horn and a trombone. I'm going to take myself off screen and just play a little bit of this back. All right, so it's very simple. There's just a horn line and a trombone line, and they're sort of bouncing off each other. But the way things are right now, they really don't have a lot of clarity. They're kind of just crashing into each other. And there's very simple reasons for this, and thankfully very simple solutions. Some of these solutions might be things that you actually can just apply in Dorico or in your Cubase project, wherever it is that you're doing your MIDI composing. I want to take a step back and talk about the importance of quality sound libraries before we continue, because there's really nothing that makes the bigger difference in your end result, whether you're really putting a lot of effort into mixing or not. There's nothing more important than the original performance. And in many of the cases that I'm working with, the original performance is just my sample library. If those sample libraries are recorded professionally in great rooms with great mics by great engineers through great sounding equipment, it just takes you so far. So you can't really get blood out of a rock. You can't make a very basic or common sample or sample library or live recording sound great in a mix with the things that are available to us. But what we can do is take this sampled performance, which sounds great individually. The horn sounds great, the trombone sounds great, and we can actually find ways to make them work better, and that's what I'm going to address here. Oh, great. Hey, Rich, thanks for joining me, and yes, just in time. So I'm working in Cubase here, and what I'm going to do, these are tools that you should have available whether you're using Logic or DP or Ableton or really anybody. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up essentially just an EQ here. Now Cubase has a nice feature where you can actually compare two things. So I can look at my horn EQ, but I can also look at my trombone EQ at the same time. So everything in blue is my horn, everything in orange is my trombone. So let's take a look at what these look like together. I'm going to adjust my window actually so that it doesn't disappear on us. Let me bring this over here. All right, that way we can see exactly what's going on all the time. So the thing to notice here is how much overlap there is between the blue and the orange. Looking for that overlap is really key. And obviously when there's only one instrument like this, where the trombone is the only thing playing, then there's no overlap. But way back at the beginning, the trombone and the horn are conflicting with each other a lot. And that's the thing that's causing them to fight. That's the thing that's oftentimes, even with really great samples, even with really well-written counter lines and melodies and harmonies, everything, it just sounds kind of like one big wall. Now, I'll take another step back and just give you some, anybody who doesn't know, some background on the importance of managing bass, because this really, for anybody who studies mixing seriously or really wants to get their head wrapped around how to do this properly, you will be chasing your tail if you don't understand the role that bass plays in the whole audio circuit and the way that we hear. We don't hear bass very well, but it takes an enormous amount of power to generate, which is why bass instruments are so large, and they really can only afford to do a small amount of work, because it takes a lot of energy to produce bass, and it's the same in your DAW or in Dorico when you're playing back. So if you've got, let's say, a tuba and a double bass and some bassoons and a contra bassoon, and they're all blowing away there with your bass trombone, and you've got all this stuff happening in the bass, what's going to happen is no matter how hard you try, the mid-range and the treble are not going to be able to come through. You're spending all your power on the bass. That's one thing that'll happen, and that can be really frustrating. You wind up chasing your tail. But another thing that can happen there is that you can't really hear anything. You're just hearing this sheer power, but you're not really articulating the contrabass from the tuba. So using EQ and starting to understand where your frequencies are overlapping and what they're doing on a nice spectrum analyzer like this one, where you can see from the lowest frequency, the highest frequency, how your sound is distributed across them, is the first step to making good decisions. And ultimately the decisions you want to make are who belongs where, and then using EQ to force them into those locations. So let's take a little look at this from, hey there, Mikhail. Thanks for joining me. Glad that this is just what you were looking for. So as I play this back, we can see that there's some bass activity down here, but it's not very significant. But back when we have right in here in this mid-range, we've got quite a lot going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of these instruments. I'm going to say that I want the trombone to occupy this lower region, and I actually want my horn basically to be occupying the regions further north. So a simple move here, I'm going to select my horn, and I'm just going to say enable that. I'm looking for that range. I'm going to try and be relatively conservative. Just take it down maybe 3 dB, not even. And I'm going to bring up my Q so that, or bring down my Q so it's a little bit more of a narrow. And then what I'm going to do with my horns, or sorry, I cut my horns there to allow the trombones to come through. I'm going to do the same thing with the trombones here. On 3, I'm going to actually cut them by about the same amount. And now what we're going to get is the horn cutting in this low mid-range. I'm cutting around, I guess, 478. The trombone is being cut around 2K, so that's going to have a big impact. I'm not doing anything dramatic though, you'll notice. These are very subtle changes, but they're very purposeful, because what I'm saying is I don't need my horns to occupy this low mid-range, and I don't need my trombones to occupy the high range. And what's going to happen is by default the horns are going to become more present here because the trombones are cut, and the trombones are going to become a little more active here because the horns have been cut, and it's that simple. So let's listen back now, and they do separate better. I'm going to turn up my mix just to make sure everybody can hear that well. So in a very basic, simple move, what we've done is with economical changes in EQ and EQ only, we've now got some more intelligibility between these two brass instruments that do have a lot of overlap sonically. Um, a couple of things that I want to make comment on before continuing, and I don't want this video to be too long, so it'll probably just be a few more minutes. If you have questions, please do post in the comments, and I'll get to them before the end of the video. But I generally would err on the side of cutting frequencies rather than boosting, for a variety of reasons, just based on lots and lots of experience. I've mixed pop albums, I've mixed EDM, I've mixed orchestral music, rock, blues, styles where the bass is heavy, styles where the drum's heavy, style where the treble is super bright and crisp. And across all of them, it's just generally a better approach to cut in EQ and to not do it aggressively, to be subtle, especially if you're doing orchestral work and you are dealing with a good orchestral library. Then you've almost certainly been using samples that have recorded great instruments, because great players play great instruments. I also want to say that in the case of orchestra, I think over the course of hundreds of years, the orchestra has actually developed this a sort of graceful balance across the tonal spectrum, right? Because we didn't have EQ and things like that, in classical days. So the best they could do is build a fantastic hall that would have the right reverberation and have the right sonic characteristics. But another thing they could do is combine instruments that were complementary. So, obviously we have the violins and the violas and the celli, and they all fill their sort of range and register. But they also, over hundreds of years, were cultivated towards a relatively good mix. So again, if you're using good samples, you probably don't have to do dramatic cuts in your EQ. But if you are making modifications to EQ to separate those instruments, err on the side of cuts rather than boosts, and I think you'll generally get better results. One comment back to the topic of bass is that if you cut a lot of bass, this is a common approach in all styles of music with mixing engineers that I've met and talked with. It's a common assumption that if you just high pass everything, meaning something like this, where you maybe do that, and you say, well, violins don't need any of that, so I'm just going to cut it out. I wouldn't say that it's a terrible beginner step. It can definitely help to clean up a mix, but it's a dramatic move, and the consequence of that move is probably a little bit of phase coherence issues, which can thin out your mix no matter what else you do. That's one problem that can happen. But another problem is that you can actually cut out the fundamental frequency of what that instrument is really trying to convey. And sometimes that can be very problematic. So when we look at the bass, we're not just seeing it as a problem, because it can potentially completely override your whole mix. If your bass is uncontrolled, no matter what you do to the mid-range and upper range, you're going to be chasing your tail. You need to get the bass under control, but that doesn't mean just cut it out, because it's also where the fundamental is of your music. It's also where generally the power, and you don't want to kind of neuter that. That's very important. So I would err on the side of not doing that. I'll bring that to the side of my head. I would not generally just do that unless I was really sure what I was doing. Now there is one exception to that, because there's always exceptions. And as I'm talking, ideas are coming to me, so I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute. And that is when you're working with synths. It's very common in today's music, especially with orchestral music, if you're writing trailer music, or if you are working on any kind of hybrid material, to be using synthesizers to beef up and to fatten up the support for these instruments. It sounds like orchestra, but it's larger than life because it's got synths underneath it. And synths, unlike organic acoustic instruments that are out in the world, they don't have to actually move air particles. So what I mean by that is when you draw the bow across, let's say a cello, the cello has to actually vibrate against the air and move air so that we hear it. And just that reality of like having to move air means that there's a limit to what a physical instrument can do in space with air and air pressure. A synth is just an algorithm in your computer. It can create bass frequencies way below what anybody needs or wants, and it can create them way higher than anybody could probably hear or tolerate. So when you're using synths, it's the one exception where I would say EQ away, hack away at it. Decide where you want that synth to be. Do you want it to be in the bass? If you do, sculpt it out and get it under control, because it's going to be a beast down there. If you want it in mid-range and high range, same thing. Sculpt it out with your EQ, force it into a box, and take control of it, because synthesizers create just kind of mayhem. They have no limits. They have no constraints on them. So if you're working a lot with synths, be real careful with them. Today's takeaways are essentially always cut rather than boost. Keep it modest, maybe 2-3 dB at the most, unless you come back to it again and again, you feel it really needs more. That's a good place to start. And although it should be implied from this video, it's important to realize that EQ gets you 90% of the way there. We buy these DAWs and we get 300 plugins, and you've got imagers, and you've got dual filters, and you've got, you know, all kinds of crazy delays, and those things are fun. But with my mixing students, I often remind them it's a little bit like putting sprinkles on a cupcake. It doesn't make a bad cupcake good. It can definitely make a good cupcake just a lot more fun or special. And so they have their place, but it's not what we mix with. It's not how you get a good mix. So in my view, and I welcome people to challenge this or make their case in the comments. I'm always open to opinions. But in my experience, I push all of those plugins aside and I reach for my EQ. And sometimes that's the only tool that I use to get to a really great mix, even on something very, very rich like a trailer. I'd probably have a limiter on the master, but that's about it. So compression is a second. If you can't do it with EQ and compression, probably time to look at the original recording and ask yourself if it's a good recording. I'm working with samples here. I've got Orchestral tools. They're great samples. I never have a problem with them. All my problems I can solve with EQ and compression. So I see some comments. Let me just check if anyone has any questions. Yeah, so I see a question here about a gong. And I would say, you know, the thing to do with that or any other instrument is to load up an EQ that has this frequency spectrum analyzer, so you can see visually what's going on, what frequencies are coming from that gong. If you want something to cut through and you want it to persevere over every other instrument, grab 2.3 kilohertz. So you'll hear, if I were to take this trombone, let's say for example, and I bump this up at 2.3 or thereabouts, it doesn't have to be much, even just 2.5 dB. It cuts through a lot. 2.3 kilohertz, that's because our human ears hear around that frequency very well. That's the frequency range where we hear sibilance in speech, and it helps us articulate or get the articulation of speech. So our brains are developed around analyzing speech. So around 2.3 K is a great place to take advantage of human hearing's superpower and amplify that just a little bit. If it's in a gong, as long as the frequency is there in the instrument, I mean, you might have a hard time getting that frequency out of a bass guitar, but as long as it's there, you bring that up and it'll definitely cut through other instruments. And if that's not enough, bring the other instruments down so that instruments are coming down at 2.3 while that's going up, and it'll have a similar effect. You don't have to like just bump it up, keep going, 6, 9 dB. That would be crazy, but just bring other things down, and that should help. Hey Shubhas, thanks very much for joining. Yeah, tubular bells is the same thing. A lot of times with things like bells and gongs, there is actually a low range around, say, somewhere between, say, 400 and 800, between about 400 and 800. If you cut that out, even though it may not sound to you like that's a problem frequency, there's just a lot of instruments that occupy that frequency. So if we cut things out there, other things just surface automatically. So if you have a muddy mix or you feel like an instrument's not coming through, especially in the bell range or drum range, I would say notch out a little valley centered around 500, 600 hertz, and you should be able to use that as a tool against your ears to kind of carve out a space for those other instruments to be heard, and you'll get really more effective results. Yes, I also see a comment here about FabFilter Pro. Fantastic, fantastic tool. I wanted to use this tool in Cubase because it's built in, and I find that sometimes if I discuss specific plugins, it's not as useful to people if they don't always have them. But the FabFilter gear is all absolutely fantastic stuff, and I think they just had a really good sale on it on Black Friday. Definitely worth waiting around for that if you get it. And yes, Mikhail, that's good orchestration and voicing. It can't be overstated. And actually, although this is really focused on mixing, I will say that voicing is very important. So if you've got good samples or good, recording, and you're still struggling to get a good mix with EQ, do look at your voicings. And actually, it's one of the reasons our voicings in sort of traditional orchestration are what they are, where you follow the harmonic series from the fundamental up an octave, up a fifth, up an octave, because those are the harmonic series. If you follow that in your orchestration and your voicings, you tend to get a lot more clarity from the instruments. And again, that's totally true. Good orchestration will get you a long ways to a great mix. So very much worth reflecting on that. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm coming up on 23 minutes, so that's pretty long. I am going to try and do mixing as a regular thing on Fridays if I can get to a live stream on Fridays. Sometimes I can't because I have deadlines. But if I can, I'm going to kind of focus on mixing on Fridays. Still sticking with workflow and Dorico stuff on Mondays and Wednesdays. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments. Mixing questions I can address next week. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. All right, bye.